Welcome back to the East Wing. This is my conversation with Jim Lawler. Mr. Lawler served for 25 years as a CIA operations officer in various international posts and as chief of the Counter-Proliferation Division's Special Activities Unit. He had 5 overseas assignments from 1982 to 1994. He was also a specialist in the recruitment of foreign spies. Currently, Mr. Lawler serves as a national security consultant and is the senior partner at MDO Group, which provides human intelligence training to the intelligence community and commercial sector, with a primary focus on weapons of mass destruction, counterintelligence, technical, and cyber issues. Mr. Lawler has written 3 espionage novels, Living Lies, In the Twinkling of an Eye, and A Traitor's Tale. The Traitor's Tale will be released this month. I hope you'd enjoy our conversation together, as this is my second time hosting Mr. Lawler on the show. I previously had him 2 years ago back in Libya, and it is certainly an honor to have him back again in the East Wing. All right. So, welcome everybody to another episode of In the East Wing. Today I'm joined by Mr. Jim Lawler. He had a long career with the CIA, and our first conversation together was recorded approximately 2 years ago, and today we're having our second conversation on the podcast, and so I'm really happy to have you here, Mr. Lawler. Thank you for joining me.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Abdullah. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to discuss, and I'm sure things since the last conversation we had together, things have changed dramatically. But before we get into a lot of the developments that the Middle East has experienced and some of your, opinions on the current affairs, I would love to highlight or maybe explore with you a fair bit about your background in the agency. And in particular, I do want to maybe explore with you the theme of human nature. Since you've spent approximately 25 years in the agency, right?
That's correct, 25 years.
You've had a very deep exposure to human beings, and particularly because of your work, as a case officer, a recruiter of foreign intelligence or foreign spies, human intelligence, that is. And throughout the entirety of your career, I'm sure your understanding or your opinion about human nature might have either been changed or, you might have experienced or learned new things about our behavior as human beings and what it takes for us to maybe do certain things or not do other things. So can you maybe tell me a little bit more about what you thought about, if you thought about it, that is, what you thought about human nature prior to joining the agency, and whether or not that changed throughout the years of your tenure at the CIA?
I think that I've always been a pretty good listener to people. I'm very empathetic or empathic. I feel what other people feel. I'm a naturally curious person. And even if I had not been a case officer, I'm always curious about how people live their lives and what their stresses are. And I believe I said in one of the earlier program that I never recruited a happy person in my life. You recruit unhappy people, people who are under stress. And I was a pretty careful observer of people under stress, and I was patient and persistent. And I never forced myself on anybody. I always just wanted to be a friend to somebody, or if not a friend, at least a sympathetic listener. And a lot of people really just want somebody to talk to. Maybe they can't say things to their lover or to their spouse or their best friend, but they found that I was safe, that they trusted me, and that they could talk about their lives, their stresses, their problems, and things like that. And my voice is fairly soothing. And I know at least one of my sources said that when I was talking, it was as if their brain was in a warm water bed. And I want them to relax, and I want them to just share with me everything that they can. And I wasn't pushy. In fact, one of my cardinal rules is what we call the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so I tried to always couch my approach or my understanding is, if this were me, what would I want this person? What would I want me to do to make me feel comfortable? And so I was always trying to make people feel comfortable and relaxed. And ultimately, that worked most of the time. I'd say over 95% of the time, I was able to recruit somebody because they found me to be a trusted interlocutor, somebody who would listen and who wouldn't make judgments. I didn't judge people. If they wanted my advice or my opinion, I might give it to them, but I wasn't trying to assert my opinion on anybody. And people found that relaxing and rewarding. And so I was able to relieve people's stress. I don't know that I think I probably, in fact, I certainly got better at this as I went along. It's like anything else in life. If you are really paying attention and you're really focused, you get better at what you're doing. It could be better in a sport, it could be better at art, it could be better in athletics, uh, it could be like you as a podcaster. I'm sure you're better now than you were 2 years ago. And you're focused, you're learning about things, you know how not to push somebody's hot button, but also how to ask a stimulating question and to enlist the person that you're talking to get them on your side, be on your team. That's what I was always trying to do. I know it sounds blunt to because I was convincing people frequently to betray their government or to betray a trust, but essentially I was asking them to quit that old team and come onto my team, and they found that to be rewarding.
Yeah. In your description, Mr. Lawler, about the idea of not wanting to force yourself and allowing others to be comfortable in a sense, I didn't notice an element of manufacturing a relationship or friendship, because I think, generally speaking, if and this is where you're going to have to weigh in, when you're recruiting someone to commit espionage or treason, you have to ensure that you are manufacturing maybe a relationship that is sustainable, but not necessarily sincere or rather real, right?
It is, yes. I mean, to a certain extent, you're right. It's artificial to a certain extent. I mean, I recruited people that I really enjoyed being around, but I also recruited people who I never, in my wildest dreams, would I want to be their friend. But I was able to find some redeeming quality about everybody. I mean, even the most atrocious person, a terrorist, or somebody who's a nuclear weapons proliferator, somebody you would never want to be their close friend. But it was my job to recruit these people. And so I would try and find at least one or two things that I thought was a redeeming quality about someone. And I would focus on that and not be condemning. You can't recruit somebody if you are basically, if you hate the person, if you just or despise the person. It's just, or if you make fun of them, if you use racial slurs or things like that. I mean, people see through that. They know you're not sincere. And so I was able to find at least one or two redeeming qualities and even some of the most detestable people in the world, and then make them basically trust me. I would have them trust me. And everybody needs that. Everybody needs that human contact, that trust. The something we no man is an island, with that in that poem. But people, even people that you would think, gosh, I really don't like that person, but even they need a friend. They need somebody who they can speak to, who they can trust, and who that they know is not a phony. And so, yeah, it is a bit artificial. I had to force myself a lot of times to do things, to talk to people that I wouldn't normally talk to. But in the end, I found out that everybody has something that's interesting, why they are. People that you and I might consider to be terrible people, there's a reason why they're like that, probably. And it's not just pure narcissism, although that does exist sometimes. But there's a reason why they do what they do. And so my ability was to figure out why they're doing this and to not be condemning, but to understand and then try and convince them to join my team.
Yeah. Can you maybe highlight to us an example of a person who was just, I guess from the outset, we would characterize as terrible or horrific. They could even be, at worst, a terrorist. But that you found a quality about them that we might consider to be endearing or something that we might like, but that doesn't show because of, one characteristic sort of overwhelms that person, and that characteristic, or maybe overwhelms our understanding of that person, and that characteristic is just not something that we approve of.
Well, one example that comes to mind, and it really was not one of my targets that I was out to recruit, but I was at a French language school, and there was a senior officer. He was a CIA officer who was in the French language school with me. And there must have been about a dozen people in this course. And this one senior officer, he was really what we would call, he was a jerk. He was a jackass. He was arrogant. He was unpleasant to be around. And he pretty much alienated everybody in the course. And yet I would try and, I would laugh at his jokes. I would try and not be, condemning. And I remember then we were very near a small lake with a boat. And so he kind of came over to me one day and he says, "Jim, would you like to go out fishing with me on this boat?" And I knew that he was lonely. He was just a very lonely person. And so I went out with him on this boat because I was kind of dreading it too, because I was thinking, this guy's such a jerk. But I went with him. And it turned out he's just a very, lonely person. He needed some human contact. And I was thinking the whole time, I don't know how he ever recruited anybody because he could be such a jerk. But he was a very, lonely person. And then later, I he invited me to dinner at his house, and I mean, he really liked me because I wasn't condemning, and I became friends with him, and I met his wife, met his children. In fact, one of his children, one of his daughters, later became one of our deep cover officers. Many years later, I ran into her. It was kind of strange that I'd known her dad, and I thought her dad was a totally terrible person, but he really wasn't. And I think that was a good lesson for me that most people, I think you can find something redeeming about them, and that they may be acting atrociously, but if you show a little human compassion and empathy, it's amazing how quickly that brings them around to where they realize you're a friend. You're trying to be somebody that they can talk to.
Mm-hmm. I have a story that kind of maybe sheds light on a similar concept of loneliness and people's desire for company. It's a story that has occurred here actually during my time here. There's this particular character, person that I think a lot of people in my university would recognize. And this person is I think this person is seeking human attention. And this person tries as much as possible to talk to people or approach people. And I think the majority of the times that this person tried, they received, I guess, a cold shoulder. But I tried as much as I can to talk to this person, and every now and again, when I find this person around, we'd have conversations. And I remember at one point, they gifted me something, and this particular object was actually something I mentioned in passing during our conversation together before I received that gift. And I didn't know that bringing up that subject about this object would actually result in this person gifting it to me after, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks of my mentioning it. And so, and I didn't just receive that gift, I also received a hug. And I just didn't realize how much of an impact I might have, how much of an impact this, my presence or my conversations with that person had on, their day-to-day lives or their day-to-day life. And so it just taught me a lot of lessons about how so many people out there just desire contact and attention, and I guess they would do anything for a conversation. And I wasn't really, I wasn't even trying to, I was just pretty natural about it. I was curious in the person. I just had conversations.
Curiosity and listening to people. So many people would just like to be listened to and have somebody with a sympathetic ear. There's a lot of deep loneliness out there, and so approaching somebody and extending a hand or trying to listen to them, that goes miles, in building a relationship. And suddenly, it's, I mean, this is a terrible image, but it's like a dog that'll follow you home, and they become so grateful. You can almost see the tail wagging.
Right, right. Um, I'm wondering, Mr. Lawler, if there's ever a time when you were seeking a particular target to recruit and you were quite intentional about it, like you knew that this was the target, and then you realized that there was somebody else who you never thought would be the ideal candidate, but then you realized that you were so focused on that target that you sort of were oblivious to what was going on outside of
Yes,
that framework.
I've got a precise story I can tell you. It was on my first overseas tour, and I was looking at two different gentlemen, two different people from a foreign embassy. And one of the people was maybe 15 years older than me, maybe even 20 years older than me. And the other one was more about my age. Well, normally, you think that you can communicate better with somebody your own age. And we have kind of not a rule, but a guidance that if you're going after two targets in the same embassy, that's not a good idea because they're going to start comparing notes and, why is Jim doing this or saying this? So basically you should select one or the other to go after, and not that you're going to forget the other one, but you're just going to basically focus your attention on one particular target. So I did that. I, of course, went with the younger man who was my age, and we got along okay. We got along fine. Our families got together. We were friendly. I got him to do a few little minor things for me, intelligence wise. I mean, it was coming along, but very slowly. And, I would never, I could not claim that I recruited the guy. Yeah, he was starting to tell me some things. He was providing me some confidential information. But I would be exaggerating if I told you that this was a recruitment. I never claimed it to be a recruitment. He was just trying to be friendly and helpful, but it was not a clandestine relationship where I'd recruited a spy. So then about a week before I was going to leave that post and go to another foreign capital, I decided we had a party. And we invited the older gentleman that I had ignored for the past 2.5 years to this party. For some reason, I invited him, and he was a nice guy, and so I invited him. And he came, and here I hadn't seen him for many, many months, maybe even more than a year or so. And he was very friendly. And he said, Jim, let me tell you a story. He said, after World War II, he said, my brother was out swimming in a lake, and he got into trouble swimming and he started drowning. And an American GI, an American soldier, was walking by the lake where my brother was drowning. And that American GI, he jumped in the water and he saved my brother. And then he said to me, this older gentleman said, Jim, I would do anything for America. And here I had totally ignored this guy the whole time that I was there
Oh my
at this
gosh.
station. And I was focused on the wrong target.
Oh my
And
goodness.
you know, it just means that you don't know sometimes. You, you really, I should have put my money on the other guy. I didn't.
Good Lord. And that started would you say, a sustainable relationship that was quite friendly and,
Right,
transparent and, wow,
right, exactly. Yeah. Of
gosh.
course, sometimes you just don't know what, I say you can't judge a book by its cover. Sometimes that's true. You really don't know. And they'll open up to you. And when he said that, he said, I'd do anything for America.
This is just incredible. The amount of people that we sort of maybe misjudge or overlook, and those are perhaps the most exceptional or the ones that we ultimately desire.
Or you ignore somebody. I was running a source who was involved in a country's nuclear weapons program, and he was a pretty good source. His access was okay. And then after I'd been with this guy for about a year or so, he said, Jim, you've never asked me what my wife does. I said, okay, what does your wife do? He said, she designs nuclear weapons.
Oh my
I had never asked.
gosh. Wow.
She had incredible access.
Good
Of course, that
Lord.
was, the typical male sexist image that it's only the male that's important. Well, no, the female was actually much more important.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a very good point because I know that I was talking to recently my friend Holly McKay, who's a war journalist, and she talked about, or maybe I mentioned this idea that there's a particular segment of the society in certain cultures that might be overlooked, and that segment is women because they might prefer not to talk to a male, but they would prefer to talk to a female. And so if say, someone like you, Mr. Lawler, would want to go to the particular culture where that is the case, we sort of find ourselves in a situation where almost half of the population you do not have access to. And maybe within that half, you might find targets or important people that can provide the intelligence that you desire.
Well, we also, of course, I have female colleagues, and at times it's better for a female colleague to pursue a female target. For one thing, the female target, I've pursued female targets who mistook my attention and my everything for something romantic, which is not what I was intending to do.
Yeah.
But they, when I was younger and better looking than I am now, I mean, I could, and take somebody out for a nice dinner or nice lunch or something. They're starting to think this is a date, and no, it's not a date. And so sometimes I would transfer those relationships to a female colleague, so that I didn't get into an area that I didn't want to get into.
Right. But it could also be, I reckon, a particular mission can be or can involve these types of interactions that are manufactured or artificial, right? An artificial date. You make sure that the person thinks that it's a date, but it's not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I ever told you a story about at one point we I one of my covers as a cover position was as a consular officer. And a consular officer is the person who issues visas and passports, but especially visas. So if a foreigner wants to go to the United States, they have to get a visa. Most countries, we require visas. And this was towards the end of the Cold War. And we knew that this one person from this Eastern European country, very, very attractive woman, she was what we call a code clerk or a cipher clerk or an IT specialist. She was the person who ran all of the sensitive encrypted communications for this country's embassy. Probably one of the most vulnerable or valuable targets you could go after.
Mm.
But this country, usually would require its code clerks, these people, to only go out if they were with another code clerk, so that, we're not going to approach, a group of people. We would only approach one person. Well, on this particular occasion, the consulate downstairs, I was, obviously an agency officer, but I had that consular cover. And they told me that this particular Eastern European female code clerk had applied for a visa to the United States for a 2-week trip. And so we were going to, or we did invite her to come in for the visa interview. And of course, I was going to do the interview as the consular officer. So they loaned me the consul downstairs loaned me his office, and I removed all of his pictures and put my pictures, made it look like it was my office. And so I invited this young lady to come in, and she's very nervous because this is her one chance to go to America for a 2-week vacation. This is her dream vacation. She'd saved up all her money. And I was wondering now, how could I get this person to do something for me? And I had a skiing magazine that I'd seen, which had a picture of a man skiing, and this man looked just like me. I think the old saying is that everybody's got at least 6 people in the world who look very much like they do. Doppelgangers, people
Exactly.
that your friends would think it was you, and it's not. Well, in this picture, it looked just like me. A man out cross country skiing. So I took that picture and into the office, and when the woman came in, I was looking at the visa application and at her, and I said, "Oh, you're going to New York?" She said, "Yes, and I want to go to New York and leaving in a few days, or leaving in like 2 days." And I said, "Well, would you do me a big favor?" And I showed her the picture, and I said, "You see this picture? That was taken of me a few months ago, and my agent in New York would like to have a copy of that. They don't have this particular magazine in New York." And this was before the age of accurate fax machines and things like that. I said, "Could you take this photo and hand it to my agent, who was a female officer in New York City that I'd already arranged this with?" Well, there's one thing that they always tell you to do or not do, and that's don't ever accept something from somebody like me and take it on an aircraft and to a foreign country, especially one that was considered to be hostile to your country, because her country was a communist country in Eastern Europe. And you could see her hesitating as to she's recalling, I shouldn't be doing this. But I also had not signed the visa, and I could reject her visa for any reason. A consular officer is like God. They can do whatever they want and nobody can overrule them. So I'm there with my pen posed to sign her visa. And she nods her head and she takes the envelope with the picture in it to give to my colleague in New York. So I sign the visa. She takes off. She does meet my colleague. My colleague takes her around. They have a really good time, and then sends me a report back about, this Eastern European code clerk and how much, they enjoyed each other and things like that. I didn't ask the officer to pitch her or anything. That was going to be my job.
Yeah.
So she comes back from her 2-week vacation. And I thought, okay, I'm going to ask her out for a drink and just to hear all about her time in New York. And so I called her up and said, "I heard from my friend, our friend, that you had a really great time in New York." She said, "Oh yeah, it was wonderful." And I said, "Why don't we meet for a drink at this bar?" And I named a location that was within easy walking distance for both of us. And you can tell me all about it. And she said, "Sure." So then I made a big, big, big mistake. I, I thought, okay, I'm going to do something that will ensure that this is a good meeting. But what I did was I sent her a dozen red roses.
Mm.
Stupid, stupid, stupid. Because I get to this meeting with her, and for one thing, she's dressed in an evening gown that probably cost God knows how much. And I
Mm.
thought, well, that's kind of odd, why we're just meeting for a drink, or at least that's what I thought.
Right.
And so I sit down and we start talking about her trip, her vacation in New York, and all this stuff. And after about 45 minutes, I looked at my watch and I said, "Oh, well, I've got to go home." And she said, "What do you mean home?" She thought this was a date,
Oh
and those
my.
red roses were my token of affection for her. And oh man, I felt terrible. I had to leave.
Oh, God.
And it was, you know, this was a date, and I didn't know it was a date.
Good Lord.
It was stupid.
Well,
I
that's
had trouble writing that message to headquarters explaining how I botched that one.
and you said this is one of your early missions abroad.
Yeah,
Oh my
yeah, it
goodness.
was. I mean, I overdid it. I mean, there is a point where you do it too much, and that was clearly one of them where I overdid it.
Gosh. And that would be
Yeah,
like completely, that would be in complete contrast to that one story you told me about the woman at the restaurant when you didn't even
right.
force yourself. She
I
just,
know, I
you
know,
know.
I know. Yeah, so there is a point where being too personable, too charismatic, too whatever, and she thought this was a romantic date, and it wasn't. She was a very, very attractive woman, very beautiful woman,
Yeah.
young woman, probably 3 or 4 years younger than me.
Mm,
Uh, and, but
gosh.
no, I'm not doing that. So,
Did you ever keep in touch and see what happened to her after, obviously, the
no, I
collapse?
didn't.
And
In fact, that's a good question. Basically, Eastern Europe fell apart within a few weeks of that. And her
oh,
country basically went down they basically became free. The Communist Party was kicked out. And, so it became kind of a moot point.
yeah.
But no, it is kind of, no, you're right. I don't know what happened to her.
Mm, yeah, that's that's just
That
crazy.
was when I really fumbled the ball on that one. I mean, I was, I didn't want the score.
No, that's, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about with years, you accumulate much more, I guess, insights into how to do
Right.
things, or many
Yeah.
more insights, I would probably say.
Yeah.
And you get
Yeah.
more experience at doing it. Um,
Right.
yeah. Let me, maybe we can transition to something, I guess, about the current affairs in the Middle East,
Mhm.
and particularly the recently, I don't know how long ago it was, but there was the pagers attack, right? And there have been many sophisticated operations conducted by Israel to take out important targets within Hezbollah and Hamas. And that got me thinking about just how sophisticated such operations are, and the effort and the energy that one has to have to actually conduct something like that, and also patience, which is important, right? Um,
This was a very, very sophisticated supply chain operation. I've done some myself, supply chain operations. And by that, I mean you get into the enemy, the adversary's supply chain, and you alter things either for sabotage or, in this case, well, actually, it had two purposes. And again, this is brilliant. It took probably several years in preparation, and they had to have impeccable intelligence on who the suppliers were, the types of models of these pagers and walkie-talkies, and then to get into the supply chain to basically become the manufacturer and then alter the devices to where they initially would collect intelligence. In other words, if it's a walkie-talkie or a pager, it would literally listen in and transmit to Israel, to Mossad, the conversations that were going on. So that was one major accomplishment, just what we call foreign intelligence collection. To be able to eavesdrop on these conversations was critical. Second major success is being able to geolocate where these people were because they were moving all around. This is, the Hezbollah thing. They're moving all around, and so, but to be able to pinpoint where these people are. Well, after a year or two of that kind of collection, I think they did start to become suspicious of these pagers and walkie-talkies. And so then they had built into this a small amount of explosive so that they could use what we call a kinetic option or a lethal option and basically take out the targets. And they did so simultaneously, all over. And they basically killed a number of targets, injured a lot of targets, They had one thing going for them that I had a restriction when I was running these type of operations. Rarely, very rarely would I be authorized to have a lethal option.
Mm.
We did not want to kill people. We were just trying to sabotage things or to collect intelligence. But in Israel's case, they're faced with an existential challenge. I mean, this is something that threatens the security and existence of Israel. So they had a kinetic option, the explosive option built in. And that was absolutely a stunning success for them. Killed a number of the couriers and leaders, and the other, I mean, two other benefits to this is it probably scared the organization so much to where they would not trust another walkie-talkie or another communication device. And once you take communications out of the network, you basically cause them to fall apart because would have to then meet in person to communicate. So it had, major dividends for Mossad being able to, eliminate the lead, collect on the leaders, eliminate the leaders, scare the rest of the network to where they wouldn't trust these devices again, and that totally breaks down their communications. Um, so to me, I thought this took patience, it took persistence, it took some human recruitments, I'm sure, to get in and make sure that the enemy buys the devices from your supply chain. Um, you know, and so that requires a lot of very, very careful planning, probably more than a little bit of luck, but you make your own luck by, I'm sure they had backup plans. I used to have always a backup plan.
Mm.
Sometimes, in fact, in something like that, if they're doing it right, not only do you control a supplier of these walkie-talkies and pagers, but you probably would set up what looks like a competing company, a
Ooh,
competition
wow.
company, and control it as well, so that if they got irritated with this company and they went to the competitor, you're still in the driver's seat. So I had that too. I had sometimes backup things where, okay, if you don't like this stuff or if you suspect something, then you go to plan B, but plan B is under my control as well. You don't know it, but I control that one too. So these operations actually, I love these type of operations because they're not straightforward. They're complex. There's like a musical symphony of things that you're trying to bring this all together at one time. And to me, this was literally like being on a tightrope and juggling plates going across. But that's what makes it fun, the challenge. And in their case, it was a absolutely stunning success for them. Now, I'm sorry, I know it did injure or maybe killed some children, which is not something I would be proud of. But
Mm.
Israel, Mossad does not have the types of constraints that we would have. The United States would never do lethal options like that. We might do a lethal option, but we would have to be doubly sure that it was against just the leadership or against the actual Hamas or Hezbollah people. When they went after, well, who was his name? Soleimani,
Yeah.
uh, at the Baghdad airport, they had precise location of where he was. I mean, there was no collateral damage. It was only the people in that car.
Mm.
And I'm sure they had an observer on the ground who said he's now getting in the car, and they might have, flashed a laser on the thing and then a drone or something or a predator or something, then put the Hellfire missile on the target, um, so that they didn't hurt anybody, they didn't kill anybody else. It was just the inhabitants of that car. The same thing when they got Zawahiri. It was just took him out by himself. It was very, very surgical, very precise.
Mm.
Again, I'm sure they had impeccable intelligence, which is what's required.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Mr. Lawler, that you have participated in similar operations without the lethal option. But suppose that there was a lethal option. In that scenario, would that the person on the receiving end who is being targeted, or the the entity or the organization that's being targeted, would they have suspected that this was coming from the U.S. or it came from, say, an intelligence community that's associated with the U.S., or would they have not known at all?
Oh, I think they would. I think they would suspect either us or one of our allies. Um, in the Middle East, they're automatically going to suspect either Mossad or us or the British. But in that case, I think they would conclude pretty rapidly that this was Israeli, that this was Mossad. Now there are times when we try and conceal exactly who that we're the perpetrator, but we want to conceal that so we wouldn't have American parts and American, we want deniability as we call it. But it gets down to that old thing about the usual suspects, and we're going to be among the usual suspects if but in Hezbollah's case, or Hamas's case, I mean, who's their number one enemy? It's Israel. So they're going to suspect Israel. Um, we're we we don't have near the fight or the grudge match against them that that the Israelis do.
Mm. Yeah, that's it was just a fascinating development. I was thinking about just the level of just patience. I mean, with your line of work, that is one of the, I guess, one of the most important things is to observe, to be patient about it, to think of the long term instead of like maybe short term gains.
Yeah, and that's difficult to do. A lot of times in my own organization, the operation I ran against the AQCon nuclear network, that took almost 10 years. That's very unusual, though, to have a dedicated team that is focused on a target for that long. Typically, in my organization, every 2 or 3 years, people rotate to a new job, a new team, something like that. And I contend that if you really want to go after the not the low hanging fruit, but the fruit at the top, the really hard targets, you need to focus on that for years at a time and have the same people so that there's no learning curve. You've got that institutional memory, you know what works and what doesn't work. And of course, it's great to have new blood, come in and show you something that maybe you overlooked. But rarely does the CIA, have the patience to spend years on one particular target. In my case, I was fortunate. They allowed me to run this thing for almost 10 years, and we
Wow.
had great results. So, I mean, people sometimes wondered if we were good or just lucky. And I said, well, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And so,
Gosh, I didn't know it was a 10-year long operation.
about 10 years, it started in, yeah, it was 9 or 10 years. It really was. And it was after about 2 years, we started seeing results. So, I mean, that in a sense was, we were lucky. We had actually collected a lot of valuable intelligence through human penetrations, through computer penetrations, and things like that. And, they wanted to, some short-sighted people knew that we were spending a lot of money. We were, and that we had not shown any concrete results, except that we'd collected a lot of intelligence and had like 65 or 70 intelligence reports we'd already collected. And so I was able to use that to postpone a premature closure of the entire project. I mean, they were willing to close it down in the first 6 or 7 months because we had not done what we thought we should have been doing. Uh, and then within a week or two of that, then things started to come together really quickly.
Wow. We talked about patience and the necessity of that in long-term operations or even in a short-term operation. But was there something else that you would lean on to as well for such a long time where things might not even look as positive as you expected them to be, but you have maybe faith in
Well,
yourself or the operation or God?
yeah, and usually I had multiple targets going on, knowing that I couldn't get all of them. But um, in fact, we started off with one primary target, and it turned out we came across the AQCon network while we were preparing for the first target. And so we first took contact with the con network. And then about 6 months after we did that, our primary target came back across our screen and came knocking on our door. So we then had two nuclear weapons programs we were going after. And now that was tricky because you didn't want to cross wires and have one expose the other. And so again, that was like juggling plates and walking on a tightrope. but we had two primary targets. And it's always good if you have backup targets as well. I know some of my deep cover officers, they'd go to trade fairs and conferences to meet a particular target. But if they were smart, they would have backup targets, because what if your primary target doesn't show up, or things don't work out to where you can get them alone and chat with them? Then you need to have something that you can go after and say, well, at least I met this guy.
Right.
And have backup plans, always having backup plans. I used to be a rock climber, and I don't know if you've ever done any climbing, Abdullah, but you don't want to have just one point of protection on the mountain, because if that piton pops out of the mountain and your rope starts going down, you want to have that backup plan. So it's always good to have multiple targets to go after, so at least you get one or two of them.
Yeah. There's I remember coming across video of a retired CIA officer who talked about the similar thing to like targeting a particular individual, but with the caveat that you look for someone who would not have a very important, I guess, position, but has access. And what he means by that is, he gave an example. He said that you, if you're trying to go for the CEO, look for the chauffeur or his chauffeur.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're not going to recruit the CEO. You might recruit the CEO's deputy. I've done that before, because being the deputy, being the number two in any organization is always difficult. You do most of the work and you get very little of the credit, and you resent the boss. But even better than that, sometimes recruiting a maintenance person. I think I can talk about this now, but many years ago, Mossad showed us the inside of a Iranian nuclear facility, and it was absolutely stunning. The video and everything, and it turned out they had recruited a maintenance man who wore a body concealed camera, and this maintenance man not only took videos of everything, but he was collecting what we call MASINT, or radioactive particles, to see what their degree of enrichment was. And nobody pays attention to the maintenance man. It's he's underpaid, he's treated like dirt, but he got recruited, and he walks around the facility sweeping up and doing things, and he's got that little body concealed camera on him, and he's taking pictures of everything. And amazing, incredible access. No, he couldn't tell you how a nuclear weapon was built, but he doesn't need to. But he could get you samples of things and close-up pictures of things. And he did. In fact, in my new novel, in The Traitor's Tale, I won't spoil it for anybody, but I have a similar theme about somebody who's overlooked, who's considered part of the furniture, and it turns out that furniture has eyes and ears.
Yeah. That's, and that reminds me also, and I'm glad you brought this up, it reminds me when I was reading your novel In a Twinkling of an Eye, and the android, that toy, that small toy, I forgot what it's called, but it plays a major role in the novel.
Right, it was a baby doll,
Baby doll.
that has artificial intelligence
Right.
and can talk, and it was used as a communications device, but it looked just like the one of the characters' dolls. And so the doll has got this AI and ability to communicate with the CIA and the FBI. And the AI made this doll almost sentient. The doll basically is super intelligent. I wrote this, by the way, before AI had really taken off. It's really taken off in the last couple of years, or has come to people's attention. But I wrote this about 4 years ago, and just imagined that what if we had AI like this? Well, my friends who work in the AI field at the time said, Jim, we're getting pretty close to where we can do that. And now I think they can do it.
Yeah.
They could, that doll, it was science fiction when I wrote it. Now it's no longer science fiction, it's just science.
Prophecy. That's the definition of a prophecy. I really enjoyed that novel, and I remember even when I was reading In the Twinkling of an Eye, I came across that scene of the this spy that's being recruited by the FBI agent, and she praises his language skills, and she thinks that he
Hmm.
has a musical ear. I remember sending you a picture of that. That was
Because you have a musical ear. I mean, you sound like you grew up somewhere on the East Coast of the United States, and
yeah. It's, some people,
you didn't come from the Southern United States like I do, but maybe somewhere on the East Coast
yeah,
or the
no, yeah.
Midwest.
A lot of people think that way, and some people even wouldn't believe it when I tell them that I never really, I didn't grow up here. I lived most of my life was lived in Libya for 17 years. Um,
Well, I remember that funny story you told me about you were teaching English to some of the Libyan students in Tripoli, and they thought you were an American, and they started joking about you in Arabic. Of
right.
course, you understood everything.
Exactly. And my back was
Right,
to them. I was
right,
writing on the
right.
board. And they were questioning who my mom is, or was it that foreign
Right.
teacher who's married to a Libyan? It's just yeah. But so you have we're almost we're gonna hit the an hour mark very, very soon. But I'd love to devote some of our the rest of our conversation to your novels, and particularly here's a recent one which just got cleared by the CIA, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yes, the Traitor's Tale. That will be published in early February, and I think it's probably my most personal novel yet. It's based on two interconnected true stories. One was a story of a Russian that we supposedly, a KGB officer that we supposedly recruited in Moscow. His code name was GT Prologue, and he was a senior KGB officer who volunteered to the chief of station. And there was considerable controversy inside of the CIA as to whether he was really legitimately recruited or was he a double agent? Was he being controlled by the KGB the whole time? And it turned out he was being controlled by the KGB the whole time. We just thought at the time, headquarters thought, that the KGB would never run a senior officer at us for several reasons as a double agent, because the KGB would fear that the double agent might actually work for us, or that there were other reasons why they would never dangle a senior staff officer at us. But in fact, they did dangle a senior staff officer, and it turned out it was a ruse the whole time. It completely fractured Moscow State, CIA's Moscow station. A lot of younger officers resigned. They were so disgusted. It revealed our most delicate and sensitive exfiltration plan because, of course, the double agent never showed up to be exfiltrated. And it also diverted attention away from the real spies, such as Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, back in the United States in the CIA and the FBI, because we were running around paying attention to this guy, and he was never did he really work for us. And then the other story that's intertwined with this is about a senior CIA officer who was suspected of being a Russian mole, and his life was in purgatory for a number of months. And ultimately, he was exonerated because the real mole was Robert Hansen. It was not this poor CIA officer, Brian Kelly. But you can imagine if your friends think that you are a Russian spy and you're rejected, you're tarred and feathered in a sense, emotionally and psychologically. The friends you thought were your friends turn their backs on you. They don't want to talk to you because they think you're a traitor. And I mean, this poor guy, Brian Kelly, he was exonerated, but his health was broken. And within a few years, he died prematurely. So I took that and I created a character. He's an African American case officer, extremely good at what he does, but he's suspected of being a Russian mole. And he's exonerated, or he thinks he's exonerated. And then he thinks, okay, his boss says, now I want you to volunteer to the Russians. And he says, what? He said, yeah, I want you to volunteer to the Russians, because we then ran a double agent operation in my book, against the Russians. And the whole time, though, he's having to endure the scorn from a lot of colleagues who thinks that he's still, like a Russian mole or something. And Anyhow, I'm going to have a big book launch. If any of your listeners are in the Washington, D.C. area on the 18th of February, the former deputy of the CIA, Michael Morell, is hosting me at a book launch. It will be on the 18th of February at 6 p.m. in Middleburg, Virginia, at the American Legion Hall. And we're going to have hopefully a couple of hundred people there. And I'm going to sign books and give a book talk on the Traitor's Tale.
Wow. No, that's something I will try not to miss. And I hope that some of my viewers would not miss as well.
Everybody, it's open to the public. You don't have to RSVP. I'd love it if anybody who's listening to this broadcast would like to come. A number of my CIA colleagues are going to be there, and my best friend Rolf Moat Larson, he's going to be there signing copies of his memoirs, which is a very special book. It was about not only about his CIA career as a very senior officer, but also about his spiritual awakening and how he combined his faith with being a CIA officer.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to also explore. I know we're probably going to be wrapping things up really soon, but I did want to ask you, Mr. Lawler, about when I was reading your novel In Twinkling of an Eye, which I will try to attach here after we're done to the final cut. I noticed that a lot of the characters, or some of the characters you indicated were modeled perhaps after real life people that you've had connections with or encounters with, maybe in the agency or otherwise. And that made me think about whether or not you would have to, if it's a fictional character, would you really have to actually consult with these people? And do they have to approve of every detail you...
No, they don't. But if you notice, I think most of the characters that are the ones you're referring to based on real people, they're the good guys. So everybody that I consulted, Paula Doyle, Scott Stewart, Paula Doyle is Paula Davenport in the novel. Scott Stewart is Brian Bannock. My friend who plays the ethnic Korean, Ariel Choi, and she's based on Dalray Palath, Dalray Beach, who is a real FBI ethnic Korean female special agent. But I consulted with them. I allowed them to give me, their character's name, and but I noted little characteristics about them. And in my new novel, I do the same thing. I base several of the characters on real people. It makes it easier for me because it's like a portrait artist. I have a model to design the character after, and it may not be 100% the same, but it's probably about 90% the same. And they're very tickled and flattered that I wanted to base characters on them. Again, only good guys. The bad guys may be modeled on somebody I know, but that's going to be top secret.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Mr. Lawler. I really enjoyed our conversation and the topics we discussed. And I enjoyed reading In a Twinkling of an Eye. You publish another novel, Living Lies. I hope to read that as well, and I look forward to the launch of your third novel, The Traitor's Tale.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. It's a pleasure always to be on your program.
Absolutely.